Greetings, friends of liberty. One of the foundational questions of political philosophy is the nature and psychology of right and left. Two thinkers who have examined aspects of this issue are Richard Hanania and Ronald Bailey. Political scientist Hanania, whose excellent The Origins of Woke I reviewed here, has argued that liberals care more than conservatives and demonstrate this by their concrete political and cultural actions. Science writer and author Ronald Bailey, a regular contributor to Reason magazine and author of Liberation Biology, Eco Scam, and The End of Doom, believes that liberals are smarter than conservatives. Let's examine these two propositions, starting with Hanania's. Do liberals care more than conservatives? In his 2021 article, Why is Everything Liberal? Cardinal Preferences Explain Why So Many Institutions Are Woke, Hanania argues that in the West, liberals appear to have captured so many societal institutions, philanthropic, educational, commercial, artistic, athletic, and governmental, because they simply care more. He says, asking why corporations are woke is like asking why Hispanics tend to have two arms, or why the Houston Rockets have increased their number of three-point shots taken over the last decades. It's because all institutions are like that. Remember, this was written back at the heights of wokeness in 2021. He continues, so the question becomes, why are institutions woke? And his answer is, when we think in terms of cardinal utility, in layman's terms, how bad people want something to happen, it's no contest. What jumps out is not only how left-leaning large institutions are, but how the same is true for most professions. Whether you're looking by institution or by individuals, there are more donations to Biden than Trump. The Democratic nominee and his associated committees have received donations from nearly 5.9 million people, while Trump has seen donations from 3.7 million donors. So while Biden beat Trump in the popular vote by 51 to 47%, in the donor game, Biden beat Trump by 61 to 39%. And when we look at political protests, I don't think anyone would deny that the Women's March, BLM, and Occupy Wall Street have drawn many more people than rallies for the Tea Party and Trump. In September 2009, at the height of the Tea Party movement, conservatives held the Taxpayer March on Washington, which drew something like 60 to 70,000 people, leading one newspaper to call it the largest conservative protest ever to storm the Capitol. The annual Anti-Abortion March for Life rally in Washington has drawn massive crowds, with estimates for some years ranging widely from low six figures to mid to high six figures. And March for Our Lives, a pro-gun control rally, saw 800,000 people turn out in 2018. But when we turn to liberal/democratic rallies, we find much bigger numbers, even though about half the country is Republican, half Democrat. The Women's March in opposition to Trump drew about 4,157,000. And so, if it is true that people who engage in protest and care more about politics than people who donate money, and people who donate money care more than people who simply vote, Hanania would have demonstrated that, on an operational, functional level, liberals care more than conservatives. In addition, and quite ironically, he argues that data show that liberals are in their personal lives more intolerant of conservatives than vice versa across numerous dimensions. Those on the left are more likely to block someone on social media, be upset if their child marries someone from the other side, and find it hard to be friends with or date someone they disagree with politically. In other words, according to Hanania, being more tolerant is a sign you care less. Hanania further argues that all this makes it hard to suggest reforms for conservatives. Do you want to govern government more power, give government more power over corporations? None of the regulators will be on your side. Leave corporations alone? Then you leave power to the woke capital, though it must to a certain extent be disciplined by the preferences of consumers. Start your own Institutions? Good luck staffing them with competent people for normal NGO or media salaries. And if you're not careful, they'll be captured by your enemies anyway. Hanania appears to be arguing that if, on an operational level, conservatives act less energetically, then they're doomed politically for eternity. So what should we make of all this? Do liberals really care more? First, whether right or wrong, it should be noted Hanania always makes good arguments, and this is a typical example. While he recognizes that liberals and conservatives show up to the polls in equal measure, it is worthy of notice that liberals fund their political candidates more, and their protests often make much bigger crowds. But in the end, I'm not convinced for the following reasons. Number one, if we ask the related question, do liberals show more empathy? Do they care more or feel what others feel more? Then in general, the answer is yes. To a degree, the stereotype of the bleeding heart liberal is true. However, it's also true that both the conservatives and liberals express empathy selectively towards those who share their values. None of this, however, means that having more empathy is a better thing. As Paul Bloom argues in Against Empathy, which I reviewed here, rational compassion is often a better approach to societal problems. Hanania may well agree with this. Also worthy of note is that while liberals demonstrate more generalized empathy, conservatives actually give more to charitable and philanthropic organizations, so they feel less but give more. Number two, Hanania, in his book The Origins of Woke, published in April of 2022, about a year after this article, offered a very different explanation for why Western institutions have gone woke. In that book, he argued, A, that bad laws make bad culture, which is true, and B, that most institutions are woke because they follow or are influenced by the legal mandates and sanctions of American civil rights law, specifically the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1991. But in that book, surprisingly, he didn't mention this explanation, that liberals care more, at all, not to take it back, nor to try to integrate it with his newer civil rights explanation. I suppose there could be some integration in that liberals cared more, and that was why they enacted the Civil Rights Acts in the first place, and that after the laws were in place, then the legal influences started operating alongside greater cardinal preferences. But he completely failed to mention cardinal preferences in that book at all. Why? Number three, is there yet a third way, apart from greater cardinal preferences and civil rights law, to explain liberal institutional dominance? Yes, there is, at least in part. And that is to recognize that one type of institution affects all the others. Educational. If students are exposed to certain ideas in schools and colleges, they will spread those ideas to all the rest of the institutions. And that's, of course, because once students graduate, they go into all the other institutions. And so, for example, if woke ideology emerges in the unis and is taught to students there, it will spread from there to everywhere. Is there then something which has changed in Western education during this period to explain why so many institutions are liberal? Yes. How much public support, monies, and regulation this education has received. In the Anglosphere, this increasing enormously since World War II, and especially since the 60s. The reality is that liberals love being in public institutions, and so, as American higher education especially has become more public over the last 70 years, it has simply become more and more welcoming to liberals and less to conservatives. The recent woke cancellations of professors were just the most recent and intense manifestation. With liberals then in control of universities, again, they have open access to indoctrinating students with their woke, postmodernist, anti-Semitic, environmentalist, hardcore feminist, and trans ideologies. It's not surprising that more than 2/3 of Republicans believe public schools promote liberal viewpoints, and only about 17% of Democrats believe public schools promote conservative viewpoints. If these numbers are true, how much encouragement would this give liberals in their political and cultural efforts, knowing already that their prior institutional superiority? And how much more intolerant would they become as a result? And if all that were true, greater cardinal preferences would just be, at least in part, derivative, a symptom, a result, and not a cause. A typical example here would be illustrated by Asian Americans, 51% of whom in 1992 were Republican and 32% Democrat. And a mere 27 years later, only about 27% were Republicans, down 24%, and 63% were Democrats, up 31%. Might the percentage going to college, indoctrinating Asian Americans with politically correct and woke ideology affect that? It sure might. In the early 1990s, approximately 40% of Asian Americans held a bachelor's degree or higher. Recent statistics show that about 60% do. Is this correlation not, in part or whole, also causation? Hanania argues, citing political scientist Eric Kaufman, that even though higher education is rigged against conservatives, Kaufman's data makes clear that even absent discrimination, liberals would still dominate the profession. I doubt this for two reasons. First, classical libertarians, are found in very low numbers in academia as well, being somewhere from 11 to 20% of the population, but only 3% of academics. So in academia, there are somewhere between 4 to 7 times fewer libertarians than should be the case. Secondly, if all education were private, it's likely that the country would become much more centrist and conservative, somewhere in the order of a 10 to 20% shift. And this would mean then that likely the majority of colleges would be conservative/centrist, and their professors likely a majority. This is the way it used to be in America when higher ed was largely private. Another point to be made is about public sector versus private unions, with public sector now much more prominent. But this has nothing to do with Democratic teacher unions caring more, but about the enormous increased role of government and thus public sector unions in our lives than previously. Number 4. Hanania makes numerous additional statements which strike me as wrong-headed. He says conservatives are the party of those who simply care less about the future of their country. So almost 2/3 of veterans who vote are Republican. Did they just enlist for the paycheck? They didn't care about the future of the country? But the Democrats who marched in the civil rights marches did? I, as a classical liberal, care very much about the future of the country, but I choose to try to change things by reading and writing and talking about issues. Does the fact that I don't go to protests or give any money to politicians or even vote because I dislike both major parties so much, does that really mean I don't care about the future of the country? To Hanania, it does. He also says not letting politics interfere with personal relationships is a sign that politics isn't all that important to you. Again, not for me. Tolerance can go hand in hand with a great interest in politics and political philosophy. Essentially, what Richard is arguing is that the more intolerant you are, the more you care. So by this reasoning, Stalin and Lenin and Hitler cared more about the future of their country than all the classical liberals they imprisoned and executed. Number 5. There are definite exceptions to institutional or issue capture. On the issue of pro-choice versus pro-life, conservatives relied on overturning Roe v. Wade by appointing conservative justices. Liberals by appointing justices and holding their more massive rallies. Which side in the end was more effective? The side that demonstrated the least. Similarly with woke ideology, it proliferated especially for at least 10 years from perhaps 2014 to 2024 and still is dormant in many American universities just waiting to be revived. But has it received a severe setback, even though the left demonstrated much more for it than the right? Yes, it has, because people have seen how horrible woke ideology and practice are. Being in power was deadly for the reputation of woke and woke ideology. because then the American and world public saw how irrational and immoral woke ideas and practices were. So in the end, at least in America, what did all those liberal/democratic protests avail them? Not much. So can we not then conclude that far from caring less, conservatives and classical liberals were just smarter in letting things play out as they did? Let's turn now to the second question defended by Ronald Bailey. Could it be true that conservatives test dumber than liberals? Would this perhaps indicate in a very general sense that they are? And what is Bailey, who himself grew up in the mountains of Appalachia in West Virginia, known more for its Hatfields and McCoys than its slew of Nobel Prize winners, say on the matter? Conservatives exhibit less cognitive ability than liberals do, or that's what it says in the social science literature anyway. A 2010 study found that the IQs of young adults who describe themselves as very liberal averaged 106, whereas those who identified as very conservative was 94. Among other studies, one in 2012 found people express more conservative views when drunk, concluding that political conservatism may be a process of low-effort thought. But with more investigation, some researchers started running into a problem. Those people economically who believed in small government and free markets, which is a significant chunk of the Republican electorate, or at least used to be, and who crucially are also socially liberal, they tested the smartest. And what are those people? Liberal on social issues and conservative on economic, called, who believe in liberty in both realms? They're called classical liberals, or libertarians without the anarchists. As Bailey relates, a study back in 2014 by English researcher Carl Noah found, for example, that if we include all those classical liberals into the Republican camp, which makes sense since they, liking small government and lower taxes, tend to vote Republican, we find that this Republican grouping has a 2.5 IQ advantage. As Noah concludes, my findings suggest that higher intelligence among classically liberal Republicans compensates for lower intelligence among socially conservative Republicans. And so what this means is that we need to break down our political taxonomy into 3 groups: classical liberals, liberals, and conservatives. The classical liberals consistently test as having the highest IQ. The liberals next, and the social conservatives, those, for example, against abortion, for the drug war, and for tariffs, last. Now, if we ask why this should be so, what's a possible answer? First and likely foremost is their differing beliefs in God. As Ignatius Loyola said of Catholics and Jesuits, we sacrifice the intellect to God. Precisely. Classical liberals in America have the least belief in God at 58%, liberals have the next lowest at 62%, and conservatives have the most at 92%. It's hard to imagine this difference doesn't affect intelligence. However, liberals, for their part, overwhelmingly believe in supporting public education, which has resulted in the last half-century in the West in the emergence and their support for the harmful ideologies in the universities of anti-Semitism, of trans ideology, of destructive feminism and environmentalism, of postmodernism, of communism, socialism, and general anti-capitalism, and of woke ideology. What this means then is that in practical terms, general IQ doesn't play a significant role since intelligence and knowledge differ greatly on specific political and ethical issues. Let's look at a number of examples. On immigration, liberals think you can combine the attractions of a welfare state and kid glove treatment of immigrant criminals with mass migration, while numerous conservatives think all immigration is bad and that people who aren't Christian should be kicked out of the country. Only the classical liberals understand that the welfare state motivates bad migrants to come to a country, to get the freebies, and that not punishing immigrant crime is a recipe for social disaster, but that otherwise, as American history shows, immigration into a free country with no welfare state and a robust legal system will supercharge your economy. On abortion, conservatives deny that women own their own bodies, and on the drug war, that people have a right to consume what they like. But liberals, for their part, often think that those who aren't woke or politically correct should suffer the social cancellation of shunning and believe in multiculturalism, that every ethnic group is exactly the same. It's only the classical liberals who see the errors of both parties. On climate change, conservatives understand the folly of net zero, that solar and wind power are utterly unsustainable and a huge waste of national resources. But on gay marriage, liberals understand that two people, whatever their sexual inclinations, have a right to marry. But only classical liberals have been most likely to understand both climate change and gay marriage correctly. Let's conclude with three specific British examples. Conservative journalist Peter Hitchens, liberal Green politician Zach Polanski, and classical liberal politician Daniel Hannan. Who is the smartest, or more precisely, the most knowledgeable politically and economically? Let's start with Peter. Hitchens, like a good conservative, rightly understands how British policing has been reduced to its present grievous state, and that NHS nurse Lucy Letby was likely wrongfully convicted in a heinous miscarriage of justice, he leading the effort to get her case reviewed. These actions demonstrate the moral passion of a Christian. At the same time, with his Christian judgmentalism, he believes in the drug war, and his temper tantrums in this regard can be seen online in his hour-long interview with atheist Alex O'Connor, an interview that demonstrated how intolerant and irrational he can be. Green politician Zach Polanski, for his part, understands that legalizing drugs is the best drug policy alternative, is for gay marriage, and not surprisingly is not a believer in God. At the same time, he has taken part in Extinction Rebellion protests, supports calling Israel's actions in Gaza a genocide, believes in the economic quackery of modern monetary theory, MMT, believes in creating a Jewish register of all Britons who have served in the IDF, supports net zero, most famously championed by Labour popular environmental ignoramus Ed Miliband, and finally, believes in redistributing wealth with a wealth tax. So like Hitchens, sometimes Polanski is right, sometimes wrong. Finally, let's see what classically liberal politician Daniel Hannan believes. He's for free trade, check. Was one of the prime movers for over a decade in achieving Brexit, check. Is for drug legalization, check. Is dead set against net zero, check. Is mildly in favor of gay marriage, check. Is for privatizing the NHS, check. Is against the centralized welfare state and for welfare localism, check. Believes Britain's unsustainable national debt is both an economic and security time bomb ready to explode, check. Is for supporting Ukraine with money and weapons, but against sending British troops as peacekeepers, check. And on educational policy, is for school choice and understands that public education often underperforms, check. 10 out of 10. And so here we can see illustrated in the specific instance of Peter Hitchens, Zach Polanski, and Daniel Hannan how classical liberals are the smartest of all three main political orientations, smarter than both conservatives and liberals. Very happy for my part to have Daniel Hannan on my side. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.